Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Just to remind you, you're in Stream B, Sustainability at the Heart of the Corporate Agenda. If you want to be here, great. If you don't, then please stay as well and join the discussion. My name is Gus Schellekens. I lead the sustainability team for PwC in the Middle East. I've got a very distinguished and experienced panel with me here today, who I will introduce in a moment. The topic for today revolves around what role sustainability plays going forward, both for the business world and more widely. And many of you will be familiar with some of the statements that come out from organizations like WBCSD around business not being able to succeed if society fails. And that's what it comes down to at the end of the day. From where I sit, I'm in a privileged position to be able to consult with many of the big multinationals around the world, as well as work with organizations in the region here that are taking their first steps in the sustainability area. What is clear for all of them, though, is that the demands placed on business are increasing with time. We've seen many of the scientific reports published recently that irrefutably show that climate change is happening and the consequences of that for business. Businesses in turn and governments have responded with a range of measures and activities, and we'll touch on some of those today, things like reporting, in some cases looking at specific technologies like renewables as a way to reduce emissions. But what is clear in my mind is that there is a need for the business world almost to achieve a minimum standard if individual businesses are to survive, what I call the Sendai line. Sendai, because it refers to stones that generations that have gone before us in Japan have placed on the shorelines to show the high tide line for tsunamis that hit the coast previously. So see it as a warning for future generations. If there is a stone on a hillside, don't build below the stone because the next tsunami may wipe you out, but build above the stone. So taking that analogy forward to the business world, I think there is a Sendai line for business and governments, perhaps as well, going forward. There's a minimum threshold that the sum of their activities and all of their actions need to add up to ensure that they can survive going forward. Helping me explore this whole agenda are four individuals. To my immediate left, we have Klaus Konzelmann from the Nestlé Group. Next to him, we have Richard Northcote from Bayer. We then have Siri Kindem from Statoil, and finally Dimfa van der Lans from the Clinton Climate Initiative. What I'd like to do now is invite each of them to give a short statement. We'll then have a few questions amongst the panel, and then I'll open it up to the audience for your questions. Please, Klaus.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Gus. I think it always helps very much when we talk about the importance of sustainability for corporates to first start with the motives, with the why. And the way I see it there are three categories of companies. They're the ones that provide materials or technologies that will be favored by stricter climate change or sustainability, resource scarcity regulations. And I think Richard will probably touch upon that later on in the panel. Then there are the other type of companies, typically the traditional oil and gas and fossil fuel companies that haven't made the investment yet into renewables or new technologies, and obviously they are more impacted negatively by strict regulation and may not be so welcoming on or for additional regulations. But then I think there are many companies that are neither in one camp nor the other, and talking for my own company, the one I'm representing here, Nestlé, which is the world's largest food company, about 500 factories around the world. We are the major, we're the major purchaser of agricultural raw materials globally as well. We are impacted indirectly by the physical effects of climate change. So we're not selling more or less of our bottled water or of our Kit Kat if there is climate change, but if there is climate change and resource scarcity, also water, which is in the parallel stream there, if these resources are no longer available, the very basis for food security, and hence as the biggest food and beverage producer for our business kind of evaporates. And that is our key motivation, not to lobby for or against specific regulations, but because we want to protect the future. And I find it quite interesting what Gus said about referring to the Sendai line. I think we know, globally speaking, in terms of climate change, how much greenhouse gases we need to reduce between now and 2050. Scientists are telling us that. What is very difficult at the moment is to break that down in actual science-based targets for individual companies. And that is the work that is going on, and we're working together with the World Resources Institute, WWF, and other organizations in that space to actually define whether the targets we have been setting ourselves, for example, in terms of greenhouse gas reduction and in terms of water efficiency, where we've made big improvements over the last few years, rather than to say, well, we managed 2 or 3% improvement last year, so that's basically what we also need to do in the future. Well, that may not be sufficient given what science is telling us. And that is, I think, the big challenge going forward, to have such a Sendai line for each individual company, or indeed for each individual product being defined. And that will really tell us how much more resource efficient we need to be in future.
Great, thank you very much, Klaus. Richard, could we ask you to share your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you very much. Richard Northcote, Chief Sustainability Officer of Bayer Material Science. And just let me make that very clear, because Bayer is actually made up of 3 subgroups which make up the Bayer Group. You have healthcare, which many of you will know and know their products, and we have crop science, and finally we have material science. And why it's important that I differentiate is that Bayer has decided, it decided late last year, that this year it would float material science as an independent company. And actually that throws a lot of challenges at you. Number one, how do you disentangle yourself from the group? But number 2 is, what story do we tell when we take ourselves for a public listing? And we're busy working on our equity story at the moment, which is why, for me, the invitation to come and speak here is actually very timely. We are building a story which is all about sustainable development and sustainable innovation. There is a huge opportunity for companies, polymer companies in particular, and chemical companies to improve their act. Now, I think we've been doing it for a number of years. In 2005, for example, we set a CO2 reduction target of 20% by 2020. As I sit here in front of you now, we have auditors in looking at our 2014 figures, which we expect to have already hit 40% reduction. And immediately that's confirmed, we'll be announcing a 50% reduction of CO2 emissions by 2020. So these are things, and along with the 50% comes a 30% reduction in energy consumption as well. So you see immediately the benefits on the bottom line. And obviously that's a great story to tell. But what about the products we're making? What about the way we're going to innovate in the future? In the past, our industry has really challenged governments. It's challenged legislation. Anything that was put into place that we didn't like, we would fight it. You know, we'd lobby against it. What we've decided is actually there's no point in doing that anymore. Some of the targets that have been put into place, we should be embracing. Because if you are embracing the targets the government is putting in or intends to put into place, again, you're pushing yourself further ahead of the competition. You're pushing yourself further ahead of the field. At the same time as all this is happening, we have customers, the big OEMs, the big brand names you all know, huge furniture manufacturers, automotive manufacturers, who are demanding more from us. They're demanding to know our carbon footprint on all of our products. They're demanding that we lower them. And it's not them that's demanding it, it's the consumer. And the pull is really starting to come through from the market. So if you don't, follow the trends of consumerism and you follow the trends of legislation, you're not going to get above the Sendai line. And I think that's the most important thing. It's in 2 years since we really started looking at our targets within material science, we have pushed ourselves further than I think anybody else in the industry with some of the targets we're setting. We're not keeping them inside the industry or inside our own business. We're pushing in down through customers. We really are trying to close the circle. And if I just give one more point on closing the circle. When we in biomaterial science talk about closing our circle, we're not just talking about recycling material. What we're talking about is recycling carbon. Because actually all we do is we borrow carbon from oil originally. We put it through, hopefully, good uses in our plastic products. At the end of life, if you can recycle that, brilliant. If you can't, at least extract the energy from it. Don't let it end up in landfill. If you extract the energy and you burn it, then collect the carbon dioxide. And what we've now got, one of our major breakthroughs, in 2016, we will be bringing the first products onto the market, mattresses, car seats, containing 30% less oil being substituted with carbon dioxide. So we have a breakthrough technology. And this has been forced on us, if you like, and because we're embracing it, we're starting to tackle these challenges. So I'll leave it there for now.
Richard, thank you. There's some great examples there, and we'll return to a few of those in a moment. Siri, if I could hand over to you, please.
Okay, so my name is Siri Esper Kindem. I'm coming from the oil and gas company Statoil, and I'm head of renewables. And what I'd like to address today is kind of the double challenge we have. If we revert to the IEA, they are saying that in a world of growth, economic growth, we will see that the energy demand will increase by 35 to 50%. Of course, then, depending on both the growth rate, but also the energy efficiency. But we are also seeing that the green emissions are rising to a level that will conflicting to sustainable development. So in a way, the energy mix really have to change. And if we were referring again to IEA, we're also seeing that they expecting investments in the order of $50,000 billion towards 2035 to be able to meet this energy demand, but also stay within the limits of a sustainable developments. So if we're going forward the next 20 years, we will see there's big investments going to be needed all over the energy space that goes all the way from oil and gas, but also into both renewables, but also energy efficiency. So Statoil then believes in a great growth for renewables, and also that this can also create commercial competitive opportunities for us. In our energy forecast, we think that new renewables being, geothermal, solar and wind would increase by 10 times when we're moving towards the 2040. So now we are in a year, 2015, which call for, big changes and maybe agreements when we're going towards Paris. And we think we need to work across borders to get an agreement. And we are calling for ambitious climate targets when we're going into this year. But this is not only about policy, this is also about what the industry can do and also what Statoil can do. And we have many actions to work sustainable going forward. We are working to maintain being one of the most carbon efficient oil and gas producer, but also providing lasting values to the communities where we work. We've been working many years on CCS and maintaining our position there. We were working on reducing methane and also flaring avoidance. But not at least, we've been working to grow in the renewable space. And we have been growing a substantial offshore wind asset base. We are then using the oil and gas legacy to grow in a market where we think we can both have scale, but also materiality. So going back then to this kind of double challenge. So Statoil is then, we're trying to meet the energy demand by providing both oil and gas, but also growing in renewables. But we also see that the carbon emissions need to decrease. And then we are growing in the renewable space. We are working with CCS. And we like to see that the coal is substituted by gas when we're going forward. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Siri. Dimfa, I'd like to hand over to you. You've got a a different view to all of these issues, just given your role at the moment, but also your background in business. Could you say a few words?
Sure, thank you very much. As Gus was alluding, I'm sort of the odd one out here, not currently working for a corporation, but working for the Clinton Climate Initiative. But I do think that one of the reasons President Clinton offered me this job was because I have worked in the private sector almost all of my career. So 15 years in the private sector, starting for a petrochemical company, working in fine chemicals, and working for an oil and gas company. So I've seen the whole spectrum of the climate and energy system, which always is a very, I think, helpful tool for one when you really start thinking about how do we truly create a sustainable world. We really cannot step away from thinking about one technology intervention, but really have to take the whole energy and climate system into consideration. Specifically, what I wanted to speak to for the Clinton Climate Initiative is the following, which is we fundamentally believe that although we are an NGO, we cannot do our work without the corporate sector. And so as an example of how we do this, for example, we work with the small island nations, both in the Pacific and in the Caribbean. And all of our work there involves the private sector. So we fundamentally believe that if you truly want to change how these small island nations think about their future and how they really need to think about creating resilient communities, which in essence, they really only have one line to draw. So in Japan, obviously, you can still very much go up. But these small island nations, for most of you, or for those of you who visited them, there's really just one line. And so they don't have time to build another line or put another stone down. This is it. There's such a deep sense of urgency with these small island nations that it's really remarkable when you go there and you listen to the stories. And so the way we think about sustainability there is working with the private sector and really focusing not on something that people speak about in these conferences very often, which is technology innovation, but really thinking very carefully about business model innovation. And many of these technologies are already there, they exist, their cost curves have decreased significantly. I mean, incredible progress has been made. And now it really is up to people like ourselves at the Clinton Climate Initiative with our partners on the corporate side to create sustainable business models so that in essence when we roll this out and we show that one can really create a valuable business working with these small island nations, once we've shown the model and when we have a proof of concept, it can be replicated and it can be scaled. And then you truly start to address the issues of just having to confront with one line that can be drawn in the sand on these small island nations. So we really look at it from a innovation perspective, but very much from a business model innovation.
That's great, thank you. And that takes me nicely to sort of the next question I'd like to pose to all of you really in turn. From where I sit, one of there's probably 3 or 4 main impediments that I think hold back progress by companies and also by governments when they look at sustainability and as part of that when they look at renewables as a way to decarbonize. There's often barriers and in many times those are financial. So there are a lot of arguments that get put forward around a business case or return on investment or something like that to try and justify not changing and not doing anything. And I'd be interested in hearing from my panel members here what your views are on those barriers, what you think those key barriers actually are. Specifically then, new business models play a huge role in helping some of the companies that are represented on stage today and other leaders in this space make progress and gain competitive advantage. So what are some of those new business models? And then finally, to make anything happen, you need to engage people and make sure they're on board and support you going forward. And that's tricky because there will be tradition in many of the large organizations around doing things in a certain way, resistance to changing those ways of doing things. So how do you engage not only with your employees, but perhaps also with your key stakeholders so that you create an environment that has the forward momentum to deliver these changes going forward? So 3 parts, pick one, pick 2 if you like, barriers, the new business models, and finally the engagement point. Klaus, do you want to start? Thank you.
Right, well, thanks Gus. I'd like to start with the barriers and maybe also reflect that on something Richard just said. You said you are following the markets, which in your business, I think it's very clear because you're essentially a B2B. You're selling to other big businesses, and they already see the trend and demand more sustainable products from you. Now, we're selling about 1.2 billion consumer units every single day to virtually almost everyone in the world, and we don't really get that pressure yet from our many consumers towards more sustainable businesses or products there. So we feel that we have an obligation to actually even anticipate those trends. Even so, we don't really get the direct demand yet from our consumers, so that we need to lead, even to a certain degree, inform the debate, and even to a certain degree, educate our consumers about the challenges out there. And there, one of the biggest barriers in that context we're facing are that the fossil fuels today are still subsidized several times more than renewables are being subsidized. That is certainly a big barrier. And then conversely, we're also a very strong advocate. We've been signing up to the pledge to put a price on carbon. We believe that we need a significant price for carbon going forward, which again is equitably managed across the world globally in order not to create an uneven playing field, and also to have a long-term planning horizon, because if business is giving an appropriate regulatory framework, the market then can play within that framework and can really act more efficiently. But we really need from the governance, from the intergovernmental processes, and that's why we're also will be very strongly present in Paris later this year to show the support that we need a clear, long-term, reliable regulatory framework.
I fully agree with that, and you know, in Germany, where we are headquartered and 30% of our production is, the day Germany decided to pull out of nuclear energy, the number of coal barges going up the Rhine quadrupled, and that's the problem. You know, all of a sudden we went from our lowest carbon footprint production center to our highest. You know, and these are big issues that we have to address. So I fully support, you know, the need for a better European energy policy, etc. Currently, we're actually purchasing 10% of our energy from Scandinavia through the form of green energy certificates, because we have to, and that costs money, and we don't pass that on. But we really feel that we need to do that. When it comes down to buying sustainable products, you can go onto a website today. You can look at the carbon footprint of virtually every mobile phone, and you can make your purchase depending on carbon footprint. There are not many people doing it, but that number will start to grow. So again, the pressure comes on us as polycarbonate manufacturers supplying to these industries to really to drive our carbon footprint. So I think that's very, very important. I'd like to pick up quickly on the new business models. We were told many, many years ago that there was no point at us looking at other markets other than the high volume commodity markets that, you know, we have historically operated in. Because coming up with business models for going further down the social pyramid, maybe even trying to reach the base of the pyramid, was totally impossible. And a group of us didn't believe that, and we said 5 years ago, let's see what we can do. How can we take our technologies today to benefit those who don't have access to insulation materials or to lightweight construction materials, etc. We started partnering with Habitat for Humanity. We're partnering with the Malaysian government, with the Philippine government. We're working in India, we're working in Bangladesh, Cambodia, Thailand, on 3 main projects. One is low-cost affordable housing. 1,000 units are going into Tacloban at the moment, the first 1,000 houses. These are using the same construction, the same insulation materials as Europe benefits from and Europe legislates for. And this is actually going into affordable houses. Now, if you look at the number of affordable houses, President Modi in India has basically announced 72 million new homes need to be created by 2020. We all know that housing and buildings use the most energy and emit the most emissions. So if we can get the right materials into these houses right at the start of business, it's great for our business, it's great for the planet, and it's great for people. And really that's what it's all about. And when you start putting these models into place, you talk about attracting talent, you talk about keeping employees happy, employee satisfaction. It is amazing the buzz that this gives a company. And when we're all out there fighting for the same young people who actually, well, no matter where you go in the world, have the same view when it comes to society, when it comes to the environment, you know, it's a very attractive place to be. So there is no doubt in my mind that putting sustainability at the heart of the corporate culture is extremely valuable all around.
Well, I don't think there's many barriers. I look at it as challenges. You mentioned framework and regulatory, in a stable framework you need to have when you work in the renewable space. And for us working in offshore wind, which is quite capital intensive, it's going to be about cost. So this is what we see when you're doing project anyhow. So I think one of the challenges we have within renewable project is about decreasing cost. And it needs to decrease because you need to have sustainable business, not only for your project, but also for the technologies you're working in general. So I think the cost-focused, and at each project, you need to have a pipeline of new projects that you can actually develop the technology that you need, the supply chain that you need to decrease the cost and be independent of subsidies as an end game.
Great. We're not breaking the pattern, obviously, of going this way, so I'll be the final one. Just quickly to go back to Richard's point, which is so incredibly important when he spoke about unintended consequences of the decision that Chancellor Merkel made in Germany, which is, I'm also an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins Science, where I teach a class on systems thinking. If there's one thing I want my students to take away from the class, is understanding the difference between intended consequences and unintended consequences. And I think what happened in Germany was a great example of, not a great example, of an example of unintended consequences, because the same period that decision was made, gas prices in the United States were going significantly down because of fracking movements. And so coal was available. And actually what happened is that coal was shipped from the United States to Germany to make sure that there was enough feedstock for power generation. So it's an incredibly important point for anybody who works in this space to always think through intended consequences and your unintended consequences as much as you can. The point that I'll make about sort of engagement is maybe to challenge my panelists a little bit, who all come from the private sector. And so when we speak very often about sustainability at the heart of the corporate agenda, we approach it either from optimizing our own processes internally, like reducing our cost of operations by doing it more efficient, or recycling our water, whatever needs to be done to decrease cost of operations. Or we speak about it from how do we engage with our communities and how do we really think about the products that we're selling and our customers. Obviously, there's a big part of the corporate agenda which also looks at the people who work at the corporations. So obviously, everybody works for an employer, unless you're self-employed, but most people work for large corporations. And one of the things that we've developed within the Clinton Climate Initiative over the last couple of years is an innovative program to really engage through corporations with employees. And what we do there is, if you think about the United States, where our biggest market is for this program, people have access to 401ks through their employer or health benefits through their employer. We are offering them energy benefits through their place of employment. So if you think about it, it's like a 401k, so people can actually do an energy retrofit for their own houses, but it's offered to them through their employer. So my challenge really for corporations in the United States and international corporations is to take that a step further, to not think about sustainability just by how do we engage our people and share what we've done, or engage them in thinking through new business models, which is very important, but also truly think about what do we offer, like really, really financial things that we're offering our employees. And so the benefits of these programs are obviously not just that you're reducing your cost for energy services, but you're creating a healthier home. You really have a good way of engaging your employees, not just about energy efficiency, but also about transportation. So it's a wonderful way of engaging the people who work within the corporate sector.
Fantastic, thank you. We've heard a lot of great examples. What I'd like to do now is to open the panel to questions from the floor. I don't think we've had any submitted yet. If anybody has a question, if you could raise your hand, and we have some microphones. As a question at the back, please. Sorry, could you start by just saying who you are and what organization you represent, please?
Good afternoon, all. Michael Nate from Aqua Power. The discussion is really interesting, and I take away from it an implicit need for corporations to learn. And organizational learning is really difficult, particularly when people and organizations are defensive, because it breaks down the ability to be reflective and to actually learn. So my question to you is, how in your organizations do you help yourselves learn from where you've made past, not mistakes, but not the advantages or advantages you would have made, and how do you change the organization to learn? I know you're going to say leadership, but besides leadership and leadership. So where does organizational learning fit into sustainability?
So if I hear you right, Michael, it's around how do organizations learn from their experience of trying and doing these things, and then making sure that corporate memory can then be applied again going forward. So do I have a volunteer from the panel to start? Not everybody at the same time, okay. But ladies first. Let's start from the left this time.
No, I think it's a wonderful question, and I really do appreciate it, because there is nothing like failing well, is what I always say. And so it was interesting, just after I joined the foundation, I was actually asked to speak at the Clinton Global Initiative, which was the first time they asked somebody from the foundation to speak there. And they asked me to speak on the panel that would talk about failing, which I took as an interesting question for somebody who just joined and now talked to us about failing. But it's really important to fail well. And it's so important to not be afraid of failing well, because we need to. The unintended consequences of some of these decisions we can only figure out by trying. So my thing is that if you create a culture of allowing these failures to surface, and for a culture where the inquiry into how you've done something is as important as the capturing of the outputs, then you're starting to create a culture where actually learning becomes part of the DNA. Do you ingrain it by saying this is what you need to do? No. Do you change an internal culture by hiring people into it who understand that and have it as part of their intellectual curiosity? Yes.
Well, maybe I could respond a bit more on the practical side. I think it's very important to learn. I think in renewable, sustainable business, we've learned a lot from the oil and gas. You can imagine that going offshore wind, this complex project development. But we learned a lot in the offshore wind business as well. So we've done some failures. And we have learned from them. We have had delays on the first project. We put all the learnings into the next project. And then again, it's back to what I said first, because you have to improve on each of these projects to have a quite ambitious cost curve to beat, to be able to make this project profitable. So you have to learn and take that as an institutional learning in everything you do.
I can't agree more. I think we've been learning as an industry, and let me talk about the chemical industry here. I think we have been learning, we just haven't been admitting to ourselves that we've been learning. We've been fighting it. I remember when I took this role on, the first speaking engagement I had was in Sweden in front of about 500 NGOs. Now, coming from a chemical industry, this is not easy. And I remember I stood up, I said, listen, I come from an industry that has a legacy. We've had problems, and we've now realized that we have to do something about that. The audience changed immediately. It's a bit like, being the alcoholic or the drug addict who says, I've got a problem and I want to fix this. And just doing that and then applying all the learning that you've been fighting is actually, it makes it quite easy. And getting the buy-in is not that difficult. I sat down in front of my board and I said, right, we're following the 3P principle: people, planet, profit. That is the bottom line. You can't come up with a better sustainability slogan than that. Anything we do in the future must be positive in 2 of those P's and cannot be negative in the 3rd P. And they just looked at me as if I had 2 heads, and they said, well, you know, what do you mean? I said, well, it has to be positive. What if we make a lot of money and it's negative to society or negative to the environment? And the CEO just looked at them and said, are you mad? You know, of course we're going to adopt that. That's a really good approach to take. And actually, when you look back over the last 10 years of innovation in our company, that's exactly what we've been doing anyway. So we have been learning. We just haven't known how to apply it and put the message out there. And going back to the other point, it's not just about, it's about educating right through the chain. It's about educating backwards, and we're becoming almost as hard on our suppliers as our customers are on us. And we're educating those customers who are not in the same position as the big OEMs as well. Because it's all the way through the chain that, you know, everybody has to embrace this. And I think that's really important. And actually, the minute you start doing that, you're getting very good feedback.
Right, yeah, probably the biggest learning we had over the last 10 years is that originally we focused very much on our direct operations, which means our factories, about 500 around the world. And we made them obviously more energy efficient. We use much less water than 10 years ago, more than half of it on a per ton basis. We decoupled energy from greenhouse gas impact. We reduced greenhouse gases by about 5% despite growing our business, our volume by 60% and so on. But the key learning was that I was actually only looking at a very narrow part of our overall product's final impact. I mean, we're selling consumer products to the final consumers, and they are obviously not just worried about or interested about what we're doing in our factory, but what happens along the entire value chain. And we've been using life cycle assessment over the last 10 years much, much more systematically, and have identified hotspots, in particular in agriculture, where we are helping now with about 1,000 agronomists, our suppliers, our farmers, to farm more sustainably, and that collectively even has a much bigger impact compared to what we were able to do in our own factories. It even goes on the consumer side. We've once calculated that by how someone prepares a cup of Nescafe, collectively the savings, if everyone would just boil enough water rather than boil up the whole kettle there and only using then 1 cup, that would save twice the energy. We're selling about 6,000 cups of Nescafe every single second. So it's a lot of energy out there. That would be about, the potential would be twice as much as all of our 27 Nescafe factories consume in a year. So it's really that whole end-to-end value chain extended focus, and maybe a very practical one when we were trying to favor more energy efficient processes and alternative technologies. Mostly the internal rate of return, the profitability, didn't match with our internal expectations. So in a first attempt, we increased the payback periods, but even that didn't really work, because there was always competition for about the $5 billion of capex, which we only have at our disposal every year. So what we've been doing there now increasingly is to have internal compliance standards where gradually we're asking our factories to comply to higher energy efficiency standards, so the whole payback and internal rate of return question kind of doesn't trigger those discussions anymore, and it becomes a compliance issue rather than a profitability issue, because very often those things are not short-term yet profitable. It is a long-term investment in our business basis.
I like that particularly because it also builds it into almost a business as usual approach for the company. No one questions why you're looking at these areas anymore.